Welcome to the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the city bar.
My name is Robin. I'm an environmental lawyer and a member of the Animal Law Committee at the New York City Bar Association. I previously did a little bit of work on soundscape ecology and noise pollution issues with the Yale Law Ethics and Animals program, and I've also co-written a book chapter on soundscape ecology. So today we'll be talking about noise pollution and noise law, which is this really fascinating, cool niche of law. Our guests today are Vanessa Zobel and Jamie Banks. Jamie Banks is part of Quiet Communities, a nonprofit that works on noise pollution. And Vanessa is an ocean researcher. So without further ado, I'll dive in and I'll let them introduce themselves.
My name is Jamie Banks. I am the founder and president of Quiet Communities, a national nonprofit organization focused on reducing harm from noise and related pollution and promoting quiet as a natural resource. I am a health and environmental scientist by background and training, and really brought a public health lens to looking at issues of noise. I also serve as the chair of the Noise and Health Committee of the American Public Health Association.
My name is Vanessa Zobel. I'm a researcher at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and I study noise pollution in the ocean that is brought about by a variety of different human activities like commercial shipping, oil and gas exploration from seismic airgun surveys. And I try to figure out how to reduce these sources of noise either at the source or spatially in areas that are critical to animals like whales that rely on sound for their daily life functions. And I'm also the analyst for a program called the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies program, where I monitor the reduction in noise brought about by the vessel speed reduction program on the coast of California.
Great, thank you. So my first question for both of you is, what inspired you to pursue your current role?
So I'll start. So as a healthcare scientist, I had a couple of years where I was working at home. And having lived in my home for many years, and worked in my home for many years, I was suddenly surrounded by land care noise. Leaf blowers, string trimmers, industrial mowers, as the land care industry came to be more and more dependent on fossil fuel equipment. I happened to live in the center of a small village setting and was surrounded by a multifamily dwellings, a shopping mall, and other, single-family properties or retirement community and so forth. And there were a total of about 12 properties. And so the land care crews would come in and in a very uncoordinated fashion. And I just heard this noise going on hours a day, several days a week in the seasons of use, really 3 seasons of the year. And I became very concerned looking at workers who were not wearing hearing protection, that were being subjected to emissions from this equipment, which are toxic and carcinogenic, and just became interested in the whole issue of noise and started researching it. After that, I formed Quiet Communities to provide evidence resources for communities, looking to address that source of noise, but then quickly was networked into a community of other people, mainly professionals, attorneys, physicians, scientists, who are very concerned about not just that source of noise, but other sources of noise, and the absence of effective federal legislation, and as well as state and local legislation to control or abate those noise sources.
Awesome. Am I freezing it all? No? Okay. When I first started thinking about studying the ocean, I had read about and heard about acoustics. It's a very popular way to study the ocean because sound travels so far and so fast in seawater. It travels about 4 times faster in seawater than in air. So it's a really good way to detect things in the ocean. We can't always be on ships out there. Even when you are on a ship, it's hard to see anything. when there's white caps and everything. So people have used acoustics to kind of eavesdrop on the underwater world. Whales and fish and invertebrates also use sound to find each other, for foraging, for navigating their long migrations. So we're able to eavesdrop on them when they're making all these sounds to understand where they're going, when they're in a specific area and how many there may be in that area. And then when I started listening to the recordings, I found that there was a lot more than animals that could be heard in the ocean. There was commercial shipping, there were seal bombs, there were seismic air gun pulses, and I really got interested in studying the threat in order to figure out how to reduce it, kind of like studying any threat, whether it's COVID or climate change, figuring out what makes it noisy or what makes the amplitudes high or quieter is really important so that we can figure out how to reduce it. So I think that I kind of came to acoustics from the animal interest, but then to figure out how to protect these animals, I really began to try to understand the threats.
Great. Yes. And what types of noise, I know you touched on this briefly, what types of noise impact the ocean animals that you study the most, you would say?
I think it depends on the region of the world and what human activity is being conducted in the region. My PhD I was studying the coast of California right off the port of Los Angeles in Long Beach. So the noise in that area is predominantly from commercial shipping. Big container ships, big cargo ships that bring us in California and the rest of the United States everything that we own, from the laptop I'm using right now, the car I drive, the phone in my pocket. So it really made me aware of this issue of noise pollution is closer to me than I originally thought it was. My postdoc research is mainly focused in the Gulf of Mexico. And in the Gulf of Mexico, there's, thousands of actively drilling oil rigs. So in that region of the world, there is a lot of commercial shipping, but that commercial shipping noise is dwarfed in much of the Gulf by sounds from oil and gas exploration, seismic air gun surveys that are being conducted to figure out where new places are to drill oil and monitor the existing wells. So I think it depends on the world, or in where you are in the world and what threats may be of concern. But those are some of the threats that I've been researching so far.
Yes, I remember I actually did a course in undergrad to be a marine mammal observer, which is a real job, surprisingly. So we learned a little bit about legal regulation of seismic air guns and seismic surveying under the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act, and it does have such a huge impact on marine ecosystems. I think there was even a study a little while ago that in areas with a lot of seismic surveying, there can be lower amounts of plankton, and which is really like the basis of the marine food web. And yes, I just wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the legal background of noise. So I used to work with Jamie at Quiet Communities, and I know they've done some amazing work on litigation around the Noise Control Act, which a lot of people have never heard of. It's kind of like a lost Atlantis of environmental law. It was one of the major media statutes in the early 70s, like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, like from that era. But it has sort of faded out of public consciousness, unfortunately. Jamie, do you want to talk a little bit about Quiet Communities' work with the Noise Control Act?
Sure. Maybe I can give a little bit of context. So the Noise Control Act was enacted in 1972. The backdrop to it is that noise was declared a public health problem by U.S. Surgeon General William Stewart in 1968. And it was known at that time that noise not only caused or contributed to hearing problems, but also had an impact on our cardiovascular system, our endocrine system, and our respiratory syndrome. today, the science has advanced so much that we understand even broader effects, for instance, the neurological system as well, and our mental health. As I was saying, the science has advanced so much that we understand how noise impacts health really down to the cellular and molecular levels. Those mechanisms are becoming increasingly clarified. It's pretty amazing. But just going back to the history, shortly after that, the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, and amendments to the Clean Air Act recognized noise also as a form of pollution with potential impacts on human health and environment, ecosystems. In 1972, the Noise Control Act was enacted, and it provided funding. It provided for the creation of the Office of Noise Abatement and Control within the newly formed EPA. That office was tasked with providing or funding education, research, product labeling, regulations and enforcement of those regulations, a quiet products program whereby the federal government would take the lead in identifying and purchasing quiet products in the hope that then the private sector would follow and these products would become preferred products. And then technical assistance to communities, states, and localities. That program existed for 10 years and was implemented. A great deal of work was carried out, but it was defunded in 1982, and things abruptly came to a halt. And we were once a global leader on noise, and today, of course, we really haven't progressed very much and are left with the consequences of an increasingly noisy world and how to address it. Where the federal government isn't taking the lead, the idea is that states and localities would pick it up, but they haven't had resources to do so. There's a lot of lost knowledge and, kind of shrug shoulders and hands in the air, like, what do we do about this? We don't really understand it in the way that it needs to be understood. And accordingly, we don't really understand the impacts on health and environment. So that's where we are, sadly. In terms of, sorry, Robin, I just remembered the other part of your question is, what are we doing about it? The most direct answer is that after years of discussion and approaching the federal government with a petition, discussions with EPA, we finally had to sue. We had to sue asking the government to reactivate the noise control program to meet these mandatory responsibilities under the Noise Control Act. And it's important to know that the Noise Control Act was never repealed. It's still on the books today. That lawsuit right now is just sitting on the desk of a judge. We don't know what's going to happen to it. We don't know what it means, even if we won under this administration. But we're determined to see it through to a conclusion.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And so I know I've talked a little bit about the health impacts of noise on humans. It can have whole body effects like cardiovascular effects, mental health effects, as we touched on. Vanessa, can you talk a little bit more about the impact of noise on whales and other sea life?
Yeah, it's really interesting because hearing the impacts from human and how they are similar in many ways to the impacts on marine species. It's difficult to study this in the field because it is hard to control. By in the field, I mean in the ocean. There have been certain instances in history where not me specifically, but researchers have been able to study this. So I'll give a few examples. After 9/11 on the U.S. East Coast, North Atlantic right whales, after shipping largely stopped in that region, they were seen to reduce their stress hormone levels with the really drastic stop in shipping, which was one instance in history where they actually found a physiological effect from that noise. But it's really you don't have a lot of times in history where that is able to be studied. We thought we were going to be able to do that during COVID, but at least at the Port of Los Angeles, there wasn't a big reduction in shipping, and there was a lot of anchorage congestion too, because many people were buying more things. So there aren't a lot of times in history when the physiological effects can be studied, because these animals are responding to so much more than noise. They're responding to prey reduction. They're responding to climate change. They're responding to disease and marine debris. So it's hard to disentangle all these different threats that these animals are being exposed to right now. There was another time in history that I think was probably the most classic example, when there was a beaked whale strandings after Navy sonar, and they found that the hearing structures of these beaked whales had been damaged, whether that was due to the sonar itself or from them coming up to the surface too fast. But to get away from the sound, to get away from the Navy sonar sound. So that was another time in history where that's happened. But those are more like the physiological or acute damage to noise that can be seen. But there's similarly to humans, if you're talking in a rock concert to your friend, it's much more difficult than if you're talking in your office. And there's different things that marine species that are in regions with high anthropogenic noise, what they do, they can either start to scream over the sound or increase their source levels at which they sing, which we call the Lombard effect, where they have to exert more energy singing louder or calling louder in order to hear each other over that background noise. A lot of baleen whale species have been seen to do that. And then their calls might be masked. Their listening ranges shrink so that they'll have to call louder or move closer together in order to hear each other. So both of those things is not helpful for an animal that relies on sound for doing everything that they do in the ocean. But yeah, so similarly to humans, it's been seen to increase stress, hearing loss, either temporary or permanent, temporary threshold shifts or permanent threshold shifts, reducing communication ranges, changing behavior, leaving areas. Some animals just abandon their habitat or move habitats, which you don't want to see if that habitat has a lot of nutrient-rich food that these animals need to eat. So many different impacts that different species may respond differently to noise as well. Some species are more tolerant, but it doesn't mean that they're not affected. But some species that we know are really squirrely that might just flee an area immediately.
Yes, thank you. And I think especially for whales that have really complex social structures, like you touched on, and can communicate across hundreds of miles, it's just such a disruption to them.
Yeah.
Yes, I know Quiet Communities has done a little bit of work on ecological impacts of noise as well, back when I was on the advisory council. And there's so many animals that have adapted to human noise or tragically kind of failed to adapt. I know a lot of birds now. There are species that exhibit mimicry, will mimic human noises. So it's sort of like we're losing that natural language to an extent. Amy, I'm not sure if you want to say anything else about ecological impacts of noise.
Yeah, so I think as Vanessa implied, noise is a source of stress. It's one of many sources of stress that animals and ecosystems can face that, really end up reducing biodiversity. And if you think about it, the ability to hear is essential for, I'm talking about mainly land wildlife now, but it's essential for them to find reproductive partners, to evade predators, to find prey. So understanding that if you have noise interrupting those things, it's pretty easy to make that leap to the fact that those populations are going to be in decline. And in fact, that's what's seen in bird species and amphibious species, small animals and so forth. So Yeah, it's something that is under-recognized and really needs to be paid attention to, because when we lose biodiversity, we're losing a lot that contributes to human health. We had Rachel Buxton do an event at one of our Quiet Communities close-up events recently, and some of her research is devoted to the health benefits of natural sound on human health. So that's an example of the kind of thing we lose that can, help keep us healthy and reduce our stress levels.
Yes, I definitely agree. If you think of like how calming bird song or like a flowing creek is, I can definitely believe there's a positive health benefit there.
Um,
So I didn't want this to be entirely negative. So do we want to pivot to talking about possible policy solutions? Yes, whoever wants to start can jump in.
Well, I really want to be positive. I think it's a challenge in today's environment, and I'm going to talk a bit broadly about some of the challenges we face. Noise is not a well understood phenomenon. We think of noise in terms of loudness, how it affects our ears, but noise is more than that. Apart from sound energy, which determines decibel levels and what in common parlance we talk about as loudness, there's a lot of other characteristics. It can be the frequency spectra. Is it a low frequency noise? Is it a higher frequency noise? Is it a combination? And I'll talk about that again in just a moment. The pattern, is it fluctuating? So that these dips and peaks in sound can wake us up. But the only way we're describing it is through average levels, which don't detect those troughs and peaks. So we don't really understand with that average metric, is it affecting our health? The duration, how long does that sound last? Is it just episodic, or does it go on 24/7 and intrude into our homes? So, and there's other characteristics as well. All of these things bear on human response, and I'm sure on animal response as well. So there's a real need for a new paradigm around noise on which we can base our regulations. Right now, that paradigm depends almost entirely on a single metric, and that is the average A-weighted decibel. In today's world, that is not a sufficient way to represent sound. In fact, relying on it really puts public health and environmental health at risk. And let me just talk about the example of low-frequency noise. Strong low-frequency sound components are present in many environmental sources of noise, whether it's a loud concert venue with music with bass components. That sound can travel miles. People can hear it in their homes, inside their homes. There's data centers and crypto mining. There's other kinds of industrial manufacturing noise, associated ventilation systems, and so forth. Vehicles, modified motorcycles, trucks, cars, that loud vroom that you hear, you can hear that sound miles away. And again, it's not something where you can close your doors and windows and get rid of it. So it's appreciating characteristics like this. The other problem with low-frequency noise, it travels over long distances and penetrates walls and windows. The A-weighted decibel underweights low-frequency components. So if you're just using an A-weighted decibel, you're really not understanding what that noise can do, the scope of impact. If it's traveling over a much longer distance, it's going to affect many more people within a certain radius than higher frequency sound that dissipates over a much shorter distance. So there's a lot to be learned about the characteristics of noise from various sources in order to understand its impacts. So that's one challenge. Can we create that new paradigm and base our policies on a broader understanding? I hope that's in our future, because right now we're not addressing noise in the way it needs to be addressed, and there are many communities suffering I would say the whole data center, the trillions of dollars being put into that, the pace of development, the impact it's having on communities is a glaring example of that.
Yes, I agree. I'm glad you brought up data centers. I'm originally from rural Tennessee, and I know a lot of rural America has seen this huge influx of data centers just in the past couple of years. And there have been proposals to try to make them more eco-friendly, but I feel like a lot of people have overlooked the noise impact, especially of them.
I totally agree with you, Jamie, that it's definitely a challenge to study these sources, to figure out what metrics make sense for each of these sources. And one challenge that I have with communicating these metrics to try to bring to light some of these issues. And I heard you say a weighted decibel. We use, source level or sound pressure level. And these are terms that are hard to communicate on. And they're not, sound is invisible and decibels are on a log scale. So it's really it's a challenge to communicate this as a source of pollution when it is intangible. And I think that may be a reason of why it's overlooked, but it's also a reason of why it can be so dangerous because we can't see it. So how, it's hard to pin down the effects of something that's invisible or show to the world what this means. And we try to make visualizations that show more how sound spreads and how sound propagates in the ocean to try to make this threat more tangible, especially to the public and to different managers. And that's been something that's been helpful. But yeah, I think it's such an interesting topic to study because I agree, it's challenging to study, it's challenging to communicate, it's challenging in many different ways, but we're definitely not giving up over here. And I agree, we got a lot of work to do and it's fun work and it's really important. And it's important to be creative to try to figure out ways to show and to educate the public about this threat. I do have a positive thing that I can talk about because, quieting these different noise sources is something that I'm really interested in figuring out. And different noise sources, they are completely different on how they can be quieted. But I'll speak to one that I've been working on for almost a decade now, the vessel speed reduction program off of the coast of California, which is called the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies program. We measured the source levels, which is basically the sound level of the underwater radiated noise of an individual ship, their acoustic signature. And we found that as vessels slowed their speed, their source levels were reduced by about 1 decibel per knot, or per knot is, the speed at which they were traveling. So if they could slow their speeds, that would reduce their noise. And we found that the participating vessels in this program lower source levels than non-participating vessels, and it could reduce the underwater radiated noise and anthropogenic noise in this region. So that was a really exciting way that we were able to study noise reduction from this specific source, but bringing what you mentioned, Jamie, bringing into account duration, that is definitely a thing that we think about, because if they're there in the area for longer, that would increase the duration at which it was being radiated. And there's definitely a trade-off and a sweet spot there where noise can be reduced, but we don't want them to go so slow that the duration at which they're there is impactful. So that's definitely something that we think about too. And all these different metrics are things that we're trying to investigate so that we can really optimize noise reduction for commercial shipping. But that's just one positive piece of information I wanted to share. And then the Protecting Blue Whales and Blue Skies bill was passed this year, and it's not regulations, it's not mandatory, it's just all completely voluntary. So if, of course, the vessel crew and their safety is first priority. So if they need to go faster because they're in bad weather, like, please do what you need to do. It's all voluntary. They're not going to get fined or anything, but it is a voluntary measure. And they've seen a lot of participation without regulations. There were over 700 vessels that participated in the program, from tens of the biggest shipping companies in the world, like Maersk and MSC and CMA CGM. So they're getting a lot of participation, even not from regulating, which is really cool what you can see with just advising and communicating and educating. So it's been hard to get regulations for this for this topic. But it seems like some industries are willing to work together and just do good for some of these regions that are of concern or where they have high animal density.
So, Robin, can I add a couple of things? Just listening to Vanessa kind of stimulated some thinking. One that's an aspect of the challenge that I didn't mention, and then I'm going to also give an example that's something positive as well. For many years now, noise has been referred to as an annoyance or a nuisance. And those terms really trivialize its serious health and environmental impacts. And, despite all the science, despite pamphlets and educational materials saying noise is a public health problem, it's still not broadly recognized. And so I think our professional societies have a role, our governments have a role, the public, in terms of pushing this information out and just getting it well recognized. That's something that really needs to happen. It needs to be recognized as a public health problem and an environmental health problem. The positive thing that I was thinking as Vanessa was talking is that in the work that we do on land care, so we work in all different areas of noise. The land care work is the oldest work that we started early on. We partner with an organization called the American Green Zone Alliance. And what we've worked on together is implementing solutions. And this has been made possible through electrification of equipment. What we've seen over the many years is that the major manufacturers have really come on, invested tens of millions of dollars in developing battery technology and new equipment that can support this transition away from noisy fossil fuel-based equipment to quieter and cleaner electric equipment. And so we have now done these programs with municipalities, with parks and gardens, with a major medical center, with unified school districts actually out in California. We worked with the LA Unified School District for years, especially my colleague Dan from the American Green Zone Alliance, to completely transition their fossil fuel equipment to electric equipment to benefit, that campus environment, allowing teachers to teach without interruption, for student learning to be improved, and for overall health and quality of the environment. So we're working hard to expand that work. And, hopefully by having these examples set by these community and other leaders, it can be adopted over time by industry and have a broader impact. So electrification, I would say, is something, and technology in general, something that we can look to help these transitions.
Yes, that's a great point. Thank you for adding that. Yes, so I know we've talked a little bit about industry buy-in and what happens when industry can be part of the solution. I wonder if we could talk a little more about legal mechanisms. Like, I know Jamie talked about the Noise Control Act and how if we had a stronger federal framework around noise, it might be better in some ways for the environment than the local and state framework we have now. I also wanted to mention, just touching on the vessel speed comments Vanessa made, that the vessel speed rule is currently up in the air as of recording on the East Coast. So there is a vessel speed rule that NOAA established originally to protect the North Atlantic right whale from ship strikes that also has other knock-on benefits such as reduction of noise And I believe ships also use less fuel when they're traveling more slowly. So there's other benefits of this rule as well, but it's currently kind of up in the air whether NOAA will continue enforcing it, and they have a public comment period open. So with all this flux in regulation, I'm glad we were able to find some bright points. Yes, if we have any further thoughts on policy solutions, that would be great.
I heard of that, and that vessel speed rule was, as you mentioned, put in place mostly for ship strikes with whales, but noise reduction is a co-benefit of slowing down as well. So that was kind of the example for that for this topic. That was, a co-benefit. It wasn't for noise, but that's up in the air right now. But I think that having voluntary programs, they definitely need, I think, industry buy-in. It would be helpful for industry to buy into these programs, the voluntary programs, if there is an incentive for them. I know that there are port programs, like the Port of San Diego has a vessel speed reduction voluntary program for 40 nautical miles off of the coast. Port of Los Angeles does too, the Green Flag program. And some of these programs offer, dockage fee reductions if they do abide by that. So I think that there are ways to have industry buy-in if these programs are incentivized. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean compensation for, time lost or whatever. But I think even just awards or positive public recognition or, a reduction in fees can be really helpful for industry to have more buy-in.
I really agree with Vanessa. I think incentive programs can be very powerful. Just going back to land care as an example, I was on the phone with one of our state representatives here in Massachusetts yesterday, who introduced a bill to subsidize adoption of electric equipment by municipalities and private business as well. And that is now also supported on the Senate side by Senator Hillary Cream. So it's Representative Michelle Socolo and Hillary Cream that are hoping to bring this bill in for a vote and with appropriate funding. So I think that's certainly an example of a mechanism that can work. I think also with regard to technology and the federal government, there's this concept of technology forcing. So, with vehicles, the EPA was able to set regulation for cleaner vehicles at a time when the auto industry may not have had the wherewithal to clean up their engines, but given the regulation and the time to its effective date, they scrambled to make their engines more efficient and cleaner. And, if we had similar regulations for noise, probably at the federal level, we might see a similar innovation response by industry to make quieter products. So that's something that, I think we'd love to see.
Yes, I think that's a fantastic point. I know something that really fascinates me about noise law, to the extent that it exists as such an interesting niche field, is that a Noise Control Act wasn't formally rescinded when it was defunded. Like, often you'll see Congress will actually rescind a law when they're trying to deteeth it or declaw it. And I know I shouldn't say that as an animal rights person. That's a bad metaphor. But yeah, when they're trying to declaw a statute, usually they rescind it. And the Noise Control Act still exists. So if a future administration came into power and really wanted to do something about noise pollution, it could be a policy priority to reestablish his office within the EPA. And arguably, EPA actually has some legal duties under the statute that they're not complying with because it was never fully rescinded. I don't know if Jamie wants to talk about that a bit more. I just think the legal angle is so fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And again, with regard to industry, at least for some industries, you would think that they would want one federal law instead of a patchwork of different state and local regulations that they're trying to comply with. And that's kind of where we are now. This was, I think the railroad industry was one of the industries that pushed for the Noise Control Act and for regulation of the railroad industry with, for obvious reasons. Its trains are traveling, in various states across the country. So having a consistent set of regulations makes very good sense. And I think it makes sense for a lot of product categories. But the flip side is that when you have a patchwork of regulations and kind of a lack of understanding of what needs to be put in place on the parts of localities and states, it's something that can also be taken advantage of. So, I would hope that at some point maybe we could get the Office of Noise Abatement and Control reestablished, get that Noise Control Act refunded, and the program going again.
Yes, thank you for that. And so I wanted to also talk about a really interesting study Vanessa did on climatic and economic fluctuations in decadal soundscapes. Just making sure we have time because I thought that was like such an interesting study. If you want to elaborate on that, Vanessa.
Yeah, that was really interesting. And it honestly, like, looking at those results and just looking at that data, it took us a while and me a while to understand what was going on. But basically, we had multiple acoustic recording devices off of the coast of California in a variety of different locations for the past 10 to 15 years. We still have them out there now, so it's been about 20 years now, but we were trying, there were some big changes over that time period that we witnessed, both in terms of sound signals like whale calls and human-made sound signals like shipping. So we found that during that study, some of our sites that were located near shipping ports, that economic events drove the sound levels for those regions. It was not it was not natural sounds. It was not, biological sounds. It was really what was going on at the San Pedro Bayport complex, which was driving the sound levels 580 meters depth. And we could see in that data that when the dock workers were on strike, noise was reduced. When the dock workers got to work, noise increased. When the when the queuing program off the coast of California, where the ports would call the ships and say, hey, could you please come at this time, rather than having the ships show up early and wait in the middle of the Santa Barbara Channel. When they had this queuing program, noise was reduced dramatically. And right after the 2008 financial crisis, the shipping industry changed a lot and noise was reduced. And it has, at least so far, it hasn't quite reached the levels of pre-2008 financial crisis, because shipping companies combined their cargo. Ships are getting bigger, so they're able to carry more cargo. They kind of figured out ways to save money. It's really driven by economics, the levels of noise in the ocean. We could even, during a trade war, we could even hear noise levels were reduced. So yeah, that's what we saw at some of our sites near shipping ports and on shipping lanes. At other sites that were more open to the ocean and had a lot of biological activity, we also found a signal during the marine heat wave, or the blob. And we found that the sounds of baleen whales, like blue whales and fin whales, were less detected during the marine heat wave times. And that we hypothesized that could have been for a couple different reasons. One being that, when there's less food in the region during these marine heat waves, there's less whales there. And so it took years for this to recover, way longer than the blob. It took years for this effect and for the whale sounds to be detectable at the levels that they were pre-marine heat wave. It could have also been that warmer water, or sounds travel less far in warm waters. So the listening range of our instruments was actually reduced during this time as well. So there's a lot of confounding factors that occur when the ocean is warming. Not just that the animals that are affected by this warming might be changing their distributions, but also that sound travels differently in a warming ocean. So these are all things that we're trying to investigate and keep tabs on as we're creating these long-term time series so that we can see these effects of these warming events and human activity events and all these different changes that are happening in the modern ocean, which is changing not just how we measure sound, but what we're measuring too. So that was a really interesting time series for us to look into, and we're going to keep measuring and trying to make sense of it all to disentangle how the modern ocean is changing.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic answer. And I think a great summary for our listeners who will hopefully read the study.
Yeah.
Yes, so I think what Vanessa touched on is kind of there's also an emerging field known as soundscape ecology among some ecologists that deals with how animals relate to each other through sound. So the book chapter I worked on talked a little bit about what's called the acoustic niche hypothesis, which is just like animals have a niche in the ecosystem that's related to like what they eat or where they live, they have an acoustic niche that they occupy. So for songbirds, like certain frequencies are very important to them to be able to communicate with each other. And similarly with whales and other animals that communicate through sound. So as we're seeing more and more anthropogenic and human-generated noise in the ecosystem, it's kind of occupying or filling that acoustic niche. And I just wanted to ask if there was anything else you both wanted the audience to know about environmental impacts of noise, just generally. Did we cover everything in under an hour?
I'll add one thing. So there's certain populations certain groups within our general population that are especially vulnerable to noise. And I think it's important that people are aware of this because it's not just a rare thing. This includes seniors, infants, and children, neurodivergent populations, people with autism, children with autism, people with pre-existing disease like cardiovascular disease or psychiatric disease may be particularly harmed by noise. And, when you think about it, all these different subpopulations in a community, it adds up to be a very considerable number. And the impacts can be quite severe. One group is veterans with PTSD can be very vulnerable to noise. And, by reliving trauma or, in autistic children, we've heard story after story of households that are subjected to noise, often noise coming into their home, low frequency noise, that they'll start banging their head against a wall, or they won't stay in the house and will have to be driven to a relative's or another place where they can sleep and be in a quiet environment. So I think that's very important. It affects the health of the public, but it really affects the health of these subgroups that exist within our population.
Yes, I agree. I think the intersection of noise pollution and environmental justice is so important. And as we kind of talked about with seismic surveying for offshore oil and gas, the oil and gas industry really has a lot of noise impacts as well. Where I'm from in Tennessee, we have like a form of coal extraction called mountaintop removal, which is essentially using explosives to remove the top of the mountain to access coal. And I've heard stories of like people's homes like rattling, and like when you think of like they physically feel the noise vibrations. So that's a really extreme effect of noise pollution, or really extreme instance of noise pollution. And also I've heard stories from communities near natural gas pipelines of compressor stations basically making noise continually that's extremely loud and extremely disruptive to the community. And many of these pipelines are unfortunately sited in predominantly areas that are poorer, areas where there may be more people of color, areas that are like environmental justice communities. So I think that's a great point. Thank you for that, Jamie.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And what you're saying about vibration, we've heard these stories also, pictures that are, shaking or even falling off the wall sometimes, people being able to feel those vibrations. within their bodies. And, just kind of harking back to the chronic sources of noise, it's difficult to imagine, I think as Vanessa was trying to say before, to really communicate what it's like to really understand noise, the exposure, the impact of exposure. So sometimes when we have regulations, if they are being enforced, you might have a code officer or a police officer come to your home, for instance, and they take a reading. Maybe they take a reading on a decibel meter, or they're listening for the noise. And it's like, oh, that's not so bad. But they don't understand that noise doesn't go away. And you're hearing it, all night or day in and day out. And it creates a very different animal, if you will, than just a spot of noise that then disappears, that you can recover from. And people can become very sensitive to different noise when they're hearing it repeated time after time, or they're being otherwise chronically exposed. So there's just so many different considerations when we're thinking of how to understand the impacts.
Yes, I agree. It's also an understudied field. I feel like we don't communicate through sound as much as, like, we have a different relationship with sound than a whale or a songbird would. So in some ways, it's not how we predominantly think about the world. We don't always think about noise like we talked about earlier. So it can be harder to find research and harder to find resources to study in some ways. So thank you all for being here. I hope this has been educational, and I hope the audience has learned a little more about the impacts of noise and noise law, which I think is just such a fascinating area of law.
Yeah, thank you so much, Robin, for doing this.
Thank you, Robin.
Yes, happy
Yeah.
to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the New York City Bar Association podcast. Opinions expressed are those of the speakers and not necessarily of the City Bar. If you enjoy this podcast, please like and subscribe wherever you listen. Find more City Bar podcasts on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, iHeart, or at our website at www.nycbar.org/podcasts. Be sure to check out This Lawyer's Life, a professional development podcast where we talk with lawyers about seizing opportunities, learning lessons the hard way, and about what makes them tick. And don't miss Building Belonging, a podcast that embraces authentic conversations about DEIB solutions by amplifying the most marginalized voices in the legal industry and exploring spaces others dare not. This podcast was produced and edited by Eli Cohen and Jalen Martin.